All right, we hope you've had a great Father's Day, and dads, you've celebrated and recognized, and thank you for letting us have a little fun, but fun's over. All right, now it's time for the sermon. When I was in college, to help pay my way through, my work study was working in the cafeteria. In fact, that's where Leslie and I met, was in the cafeteria working together. And in college, you made a little extra money working in the cafeteria by working banquets. Now, the problem was that the banquet facility was all the way across the campus from the cafeteria facility, so we'd have to get everything prepared and ready over there, and then we'd have to truck it all across the campus and get it ready and set up over there. And so we were getting ready for a banquet one evening, one afternoon actually, and I was moving a stand of stemware, glass stemware for this banquet, and it was on a metal square frame, and then just had those, you've seen those stacks of those plastic crates, those cases that hold the glasses. And so it's probably my height, they're a little taller, and we're just moving it across the campus and pushing it. And on the sidewalk there, going across campus, and it was just, we were making good time, we were talking, there was a bunch of us moving in, and I was in charge of the glasses. And I just remember it's kind of these big casters on the end, on the bottom of that crate, and just going across that sidewalk, very rhythmically, ka-thunk, 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 those wheels, ka-thunk, ka-thunk, hitting those seams, ka-thunk, 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 until I wasn't paying attention, and there was a little seam in the sidewalk that was out of kind of line, and that wheel just hit it, and everything stopped. It was ka-thunk, ka-thunk, ka-thunk. And that thing, and like everything, the world went into slow motion as that thing just starts to fall like a tree in the forest, like just kind of starts leaning over, and I could see this thing happening. I know this was going. I grabbed onto that thing and then ultimately just rode it all the way to the ground. And just glass, hundreds of glasses, everywhere, and the whole campus goes silent, like looking, and I look over at me, and I'm on my all fours on top of these glasses, looking around. Why do I say that? Well, because that experience is a little like what we experience when we read some of the words of Jesus. Sometimes what Jesus says, it goes down real easy. It's words we love. They're inspiring, they're motivational, they're healing, they're helpful, they're encouraging, really good stuff. And we love those words, and we memorize those words, and we put those words on our walls. Those are all great words. But every now and then, he will say something that seems so out of character, that seems to come out of left field, that we're not quite sure what to deal with. And it's like he says it, and it's like the wheel catches in the concrete, and everything comes crashing down. And it's just kind of upsetting, and we're not quite sure what to do with those words. We don't know how to apply them. We don't know how to interpret them. But we do know this, that Jesus never wastes a word. He never wastes anything. Everything he says with intentionality. He chooses every word carefully, which means these words are still important. We may not initially understand them at the first pass, but when we kind of dig into them, we find that there's great value in them. There's great truth in them. And we want to do that. That's what we're going to do over the course of this series, is we're going to take some of these startling, kind of unexpected, sometimes borderline offensive things that Jesus says, and we're going to try to understand what he's saying to us today. And so today we're looking in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 6, and this is the teaching we're going to spend our time with and understand. He says, "Do not give dogs what is sacred, and do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." Now, what we have here is really two parables, what they're called the two micro parables. Now, a parable, of course, is a story or a scene that is set up with common language, a common picture, something that people understand, that they're very familiar with, but it is something that communicates a deep spiritual truth. And Jesus uses parables all throughout his ministry. And what he does in this case is he stacks two parables right on top of one another to drive home a point, which is also something he did in other places. And so you have these two pictures, dogs and pigs, and this idea of a pearl. Now, the first step in interpreting a parable is to try to decipher, try to understand what the images in the story mean. What do they represent? What do these things symbolize? So let's talk about those things. We're going to start first with the pearl. What does the pearl mean? He talks about throwing our pearls to pigs. What does it mean to be a pearl? Well, the pearl was something that was both in that day and this day, it was both exquisitely beautiful and extremely valuable. Now, what is beautiful and valuable? Well, Jesus is comparing the pearl to what we would call the gospel. All right, now, I don't want to assume that everybody understands what I mean by when we say the gospel. We use that word, we throw that word out a bunch, and we just think everybody gets it, everybody understands it. What does it mean when we say the gospel? Well, that is one of the most pregnant words in the English language. It's so packed with meaning and significance, and really it's almost shorthand for all of this great theology about who God is, who we are, what God did on our behalf. I mean, contained within that word is the whole idea of our sin and God's salvation and redemption and really history. The history of humanity is kind of encapsulated even in that word about who we were, what God did, and how he saves us. And so we say the gospel, we're saying that's the message, right? To understand something, to respond to something, you have to be told something. And the message of God's salvation is what we share with other people so that they can understand it and respond to it, put their faith in it. And so we kind of encapsulate this message of God's love and his salvation and what he did for us through Jesus on the cross into this idea of the gospel. I love how Tim Keller sums up the heart of the gospel. The gospel message is you are far more wicked and evil than you ever thought, but you are also simultaneously far more loved and cherished than you ever imagined. That's the picture of the gospel. So when we say the gospel, we mean that's the sum total of the message of God's salvation coming into the world to heal the world and the people of the world through that message. And it's what we've been entrusted with as Christians, and that what we share with other people when we have the opportunity, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So the pearl is the gospel message. It's the beautiful, valuable message of God's salvation for the world. So he uses this idea of the pearl as the gospel in other places. And we can show you another one just real quickly, just as an example. Matthew 13. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything that he had and bought it. So he says he saw this pearl, which was the gospel, and responds to that valuable, beautiful thing. Now, I want you to put that on the shelf just for a moment because we're going to come back at the end and really understand that a little bit more. So the pearl is the gospel, all right? What about the pigs and the dogs? Well, here's what's interesting. Pigs and dogs in that culture were kind of on the same level. They were on the same status. They were both unclean. They were ceremonially unclean. That, people did not have the esteem for dogs in that world that they do today. It's funny how things have changed, right, between dogs and pigs over the last 2,000 years. Dogs apparently have had much better PR because they've done really well. Their reputations are a lot better than they were in the first century. So because of that, we're going to focus on pigs because I think it's just easier for us to understand. But understand, when Jesus says this, they're on the same level of being an animal that is unclean. And what does he mean by that? When he says this was a pig or a dog, this was an animal that was looked down on as ignorant or indiscriminate. This was an animal that lived in its filth, that would eat anything, even dead things that made them ceremonially unclean. And we have a hard time understanding that. Right? Pigs we get, dogs not so much, but dogs still, guys, I know you love your dog, but they're still filthy. They're still awful. Like we have to be reminded of that every now and then, right? We saw this the other day. We're in the backyard, and one of our dogs, who we love these dogs, but I look down, and this dog is rubbing his face on a bug, a dead bug, and I'm like, ugh, that's what he tries to lick us with. Don't do that. That's awful. But pigs are easier, so let's stick with them. So pigs represent, if you will, they represent someone who we would say is lost, right? Someone who is an unbeliever, someone who has not been redeemed or regenerated. They're not a Christian, all right? Now, so the picture of an unredeemed person who is still kind of living in, if you will, it's a very graphic picture, but it's not meant to be insulting. It's meant to be clear. I want to be clear about that, right? Jesus is not trying to insult anybody. He's just trying to be clear in his imagery. It's a picture of someone who is, in a way, living in their own spiritual filth, right? That needs to be forgiven, needs to be redeemed, needs to be transformed. Someone who is still controlled by their appetites. Their appetites rule them like a dog or like a pig. Now, here's the thing you got to understand. I know it kind of feels a little offensive to call, to kind of take this category of people and say, these are the pigs. We have to understand in this room, there are people who are lost, people who are unbelieving, people who are believing. There are Christians and non-Christians even in this room. And you might want to say, well, these are people, yeah, you guys are pigs and you guys are not. All right, either way, listen, either if you aren't a pig today, okay, you were a pig at some point. So before you get too proud of yourself, you may not be a pig, but you were a pig. And let me add this, so just to kind of tamp down our spiritual pride. Even though you may not be a pig anymore, you still have pig tendencies. Sometimes we revert back to our pigness. So let's not get too proud about not being a pig, okay? You pigs. All right, so so you get to Matthew 7:6, and here's the thing. We want to interpret it like this, because this is real easy. And this is not just an easy, lazy way to interpret it, but it also is a way that we interpret it that feeds our pride. And we interpret it this way. Don't feed pigs. That's what Jesus is telling us. He's telling us that we shouldn't feed the pigs. And why is that? Well, because the idea, here's how we interpret it, and we interpret it incorrectly. The idea is there are people out there that are so lost, right? They are so entrenched in their unbelief. They are so hostile to the reality of God. They are so resistant to the love of God. They're too far gone. There's no hope for them. There's no help for them. So we shouldn't even bother sharing the gospel with them. So we interpret this as don't feed the pigs. And that feeds not the pigs, but it feeds our ego. It feeds our pride. Now, it's easy to kind of get there because we think Jesus says this somewhere else. In Matthew chapter 10, he says, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or that town and shake the dust off your feet. And you come to Matthew 7:6, and you think it means sharing the gospel with someone who's too far gone, sharing the message of God's love for them, with someone who is clearly uninterested. Is just a waste of our time and could possibly put ourselves at risk. So we look at that and we interpret it as don't feed the pigs. The problem with Matthew 10 and Matthew 7 is that when you really understand them, there's a striking difference. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is teaching that you do this when someone responds to the gospel that has been presented. Like if you go and you share the gospel and someone's not interested, he says, okay, you can move on. You can move on from that town. You can move on from that house. You've shared. You've done what you can. It's okay to move on. Then you get to Matthew 7, and he's using this picture, this parable of the don't throw your pearls to the pigs. And in Matthew 7, what you see is the way we interpret it to be a preemptive decision to not present the gospel because of rejection. So in one, he says you can move on because you've experienced actual rejection. And then in Matthew 7, when we misinterpret this, we think, I don't have to share the gospel because of the anticipation of rejection. So in the end, here's the problem with it. When we misinterpret Matthew 7:6, we give ourselves permission to prejudge a whole category of people and decide whether or not they are worth the time and the effort of preaching the truth. In the first one, you look at someone and you see someone who has rejected the gospel. In the misinterpretation of Matthew 7:6, you actually are the one doing the rejecting. And that's not your job. And so we have a problem when we do it, when we look at it like that. What we do is we make ourselves the gatekeepers of the message. And we decide, we prejudge who is worthy of the message or not. Listen, when he talks about pigs, I know it feels weird to call somebody a pig or to put somebody in the category of a pig. I want you to understand, it's not a criticism. It's not an insult. I don't think Jesus is criticizing the pig for being a pig. I actually think this is a very subtle way. He is criticizing religious people for trying to feed pearls to pigs. And so in a way, this is a story, this is a parable for believers. And I know we try to always acknowledge that there are people in our services who do not believe, who are not Christians. And some of you are here and you are investigating, you're asking questions, you're kicking the tires of Christianity. And I hope something I say today still has a great value to you. And we're going to get into something a little bit later that I hope is helpful to you as you process Christianity. But really today, you get to listen to me talk to other believers, because I need to share some things with them that I think you need to hear. Hopefully, maybe you'll be encouraged by hearing some of this. So the point of the parable is not don't feed the pigs. The point of the parable is this is how you should actually feed a pig. See, because you can't force the gospel on someone who isn't ready to hear it. You do more harm than good when you try to push the truth on people who aren't ready for it. And that's what he means when he says, don't throw your pearls to pigs. And the word there, the key word in this is the word throw, because it indicates an indiscriminate, unthoughtful, insensitive casting of the gospel out there to whoever is in front of you. It's kind of the shotgun approach. It's like a carpet bombing of the gospel. It's like you see the guys in the street and they're kind of the street preachers and they're just out there calling out the truths of the gospel. And what they're saying, and so much of what they're saying is actually true and right and correct. And they're just hoping it catches someone, but they're just throwing it out there for anyone out there. And the people that are hitting it, they may not be ready for it. And when they're not ready for it, it's not going to do them or you any good. It's not a casual tossing. It's not a thoughtless casting of the gospel. When we take something, and remember, it's a pearl, and a pearl is valuable, and a pearl is beautiful. And when you take something that's so valuable and so beautiful as the gospel, and you handle it so flippantly, and you treat the truth of it so cavalierly, it shows both a disrespect for the message and your audience. And we cannot disrespect the message, and we should not disrespect the audience. Because guys, listen, the gospel, it's a beautiful thing. It is good news. That's what the word means. It's good news. And we call it news because you know what? Because we get up every day and we turn on the news because the news tells us the reality we now live in, and it helps us to live in that reality. And so the gospel is a declaration of a new reality, and it helps us to now live in this new reality. So it's good for us, but it's hard. It's still hard to hear. It may be good, but it's hard to hear. Do you know why? Because the gospel forces us to acknowledge things about ourselves that we try to keep hidden even from ourselves. I know sometimes we talk about how we try to hide our true selves from one another, but let me tell you something. There are parts of your heart, there are parts of your life that you don't even want to acknowledge to yourself. But the gospel requires us to understand that, to grasp that, to acknowledge that, to confess that. You know why? You cannot fully understand. You can never fully appreciate the love that God has for you and the lengths that God went for you if you don't fully appreciate who you were at the time that he loved you and he died for you. We have to grasp that. And so listen, the gospel is good news. It's beautiful news. It's valuable news, but it doesn't mean it's easy to take. It doesn't mean it's easy to swallow. And we should not make it more difficult by sharing it the way that we do without any thought or intention. And here's the thing. Some of you bear these scars. You bear the scars of well-meaning Christians who just hid behind this idea of the truth. They weaponized the truth and used it against you. They used the idea of truth and being correct as an excuse to say anything they want to say, however they want to say it. They pride themselves on just telling it how it is. And when they tell it like it is, what happens? Well, sometimes the other person gets hurt, they get angry, they get defensive, and you know what? It's not their problem. I'm just telling the truth. It's your problem. You just can't handle the truth. That's not true. We have to be considerate with how we share that truth. We don't ever change that truth, We don't ever alter that truth, but I do think we have to be considerate on how and when and the language that we use to share that truth. Francis Schaeffer's one of my favorites, and he wrote this. He says, each generation of the church, in each setting, has the responsibility of communicating the gospel in understandable terms, considering the language and the thought forms of that setting. We live in a particular setting. And some of the reasons that we are struggling as Christians is because we've been lazy. We've not given thought to the questions that people in our setting are asking, the things that they're dealing with, and how we can then show them how the gospel can actually meet them where they are, finding their cultural language. It's why when missionaries go on the field, one of the things we require of them is that they learn the heart language of the people and the culture they're trying to share this with. It's worth the effort so that they can share it in a way that those that can hear it can receive it, can understand it. Now listen, the problem that we have is we share it in the English, but that doesn't mean there's still ways that we don't have to understand or translate or kind of contextualize how we share this beautiful, valuable news. This is our setting. What do you know about our setting? How are you translating this amazing news into the language of the people in our setting? Schaeffer says this, he concludes this. He goes, there's nothing more ugly than orthodoxy without understanding or without compassion. What do you mean? He means by that, he says, you can be orthodox, which means you can be correct. But if you are correct and you're not compassionate, it's an ugly thing. Let's not be ugly. So we have to know and understand our audience. So what does this little parable tell us about how we should be trying to communicate the gospel and about the people we're trying to communicate the gospel to? Well, let's look at the pig's reaction. What does the pig do? You throw pearls to pigs. What do pigs do naturally? Nothing. We look at that and we say, well, they trample on it. And we interpret that means that they are making a statement. They're intentionally trampling on the pearl, right? That this is how they show their hostility to God and how they demonstrate how hardened they are to the love of God. That they are intentionally making a statement by trampling on the pearl. No, Jesus' point is that they trample on the pearl because they don't know what the pearl is. They don't know the value of the pearl. We sometimes look at that and think the pig is a category of some super sinner, but in reality, the pig is just an ordinary, everyday, run-of-the-mill sinner. It's like all of us. And the pigs are doing what any pig would do if you tried to feed him pearls. And we throw that out there, and we're offended because they don't respond to them the way we think they should respond to them. But what would you expect a pig to do? The pig doesn't step on them because they're trying to make the statement. It's not hostility. It's just apathy. They don't know. They don't recognize the value, or they don't see the beauty of the pearl because at that stage in their life, they're unable to. They don't have the spiritual perception to see it, or they've not been led to see it. Different forms of life: plant life, animal life, human life. The things that set us apart, so many different categories that set us apart. One of the things that sets us apart primarily is how we perceive and respond to our environment. Even a plant, as simple as a plant is in terms of a living organism, it still has the ability to respond in its environment to certain stimuli in its environment. Because we know that because flowers will turn even towards the sun, right? Then you go up to the next level, animal life. Now, animal life, they are able to perceive a lot more. Plants have very limited awareness, but animals have even more awareness. So if you think about it, a pig is far more perceptive than a houseplant. But they have less awareness to their environment than a human. A pig can tell you the difference between pearls and peanuts, but unlike a human, a pig cannot tell you what is beautiful, or what is just, or what is noble, or what is lovely, or what is right, because they do not have that ability to perceive to that level. But even as humans, we have a limited perception. We tend to be, we've talked about this before, locked in on the physical side of our world, and we sometimes become and are, I think inherently, we're born with a spiritual blindness. We're blind to spiritual realities. And it seems the point that Jesus is trying to make is, we talks about pigs, these are just people doing what they do. This is who they are outside of faith, outside of a relationship with him. They're responding in a very natural way because they have not had a supernatural transformation. And the natural human heart just doesn't have the ability to see and to grasp the beauty and the value of the gospel any more than a pig has the ability to see and to grasp the value and the beauty of a pearl. We only see the things that are useful to us. We only value the things that make us, we think, happy. What does a pig want? A pig just wants to eat. What makes a pig happy? An endless supply of food. That's it. So the pig looks at the pearl and doesn't see anything of any value in it. Doesn't see anything that will get it any closer to what it thinks it wants or what it needs. And I think sometimes we do the same thing. Initially, when we first receive the gospel, we hear the gospel, we don't always respond. Now, no, it can happen, I get it. But I know for many of us, our first exposure to the gospel, we really often don't see something that we want or that we desire. Doesn't seem useful to us. Doesn't seem how it can make us happy. The problem that we have is that we think we know what actually we need. And we're looking for instant relief from our emotional pain. We're looking for instant satisfaction for our physical appetites, which is why the human heart looks at the gospel, at least initially, with as much interest as a pig looks at a pearl. It's just this sight of blindness. And I know that. Listen, I don't know if you can go back into your history and remember these moments for you, but I have a very clear moment of when I was living very much as a pig. I was probably 14 years old. I ended up at Six Flags with some friends going to a concert. Turns out it was a Christian concert, and I wasn't even a Christian at the time. I didn't become a Christian until I was 17. But I ended up at a Christian concert because I was out there with my friends. And I liked it because the music was loud. Who was the band? Remember, you guys remember Stryper? Yeah, To Hell with the Devil, right? That's exactly where I was at. I was at a Stryper concert with a bunch of Christians and a Christian band as a non-Christian. And I remember being so annoyed because between every song, he would stop and preach the gospel. I'm like, oh, not this again. Just play your music, right? That's all I want. I'm not interested in what you have to say. I just want to hear the music. I was completely insensitive to it. I could care less about what he was saying. They were passing Bibles out and all this stuff. I didn't care. Why is that? Because I was very much living as a pig. Well, you clearly didn't stay that way. What happened? Well, somewhere in my personal history, that gospel message that he was trying to preach that night at the concert finally came home. And I got it. I understood it. And it changed me. And I stopped being a pig and I became fully human because I gained a spiritual awareness that I did not have before. How does that happen? Let me tell you how it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen by becoming a better pig. It doesn't happen by becoming an improved pig. It happens when the gospel intersects with our lives and we respond to it. We finally get it. It all dawns on us and we become in that moment what Paul calls a new creation. We become whole new people. C.S. Lewis said, God became man to turn creatures into sons, not to produce better men of the old kind, but to produce a new kind of man. That's the great fallacy of religion. Religion is not, it doesn't improve you. It doesn't make you a better person, better father, better husband. I mean, that's the side effects of it. But the reason, what Christianity does is it makes you a new person. A new creation. Completely transforms us. So how do we do that? How then do we, if we're not just to thoughtlessly cast the pearls before the pigs, how then do we share this gospel message in a way that will be received, in a much more effective way, in a much more targeted, thoughtful, intentional way? 3 things real quick. We have to be patient. We have to be patient. Let's don't get mad when they don't respond how we want them to respond, when they don't seem to care about what we care so much about. We have to remember, people who are not believers are not going to act like believers. And I don't know why we think they should. So let's be patient, but also let's be persistent. Don't give up. Don't give up. You know why we give up? Because they're projects, not people. And that's never the case. Francis Schaeffer said this, and it just floored me, that when you're sharing your faith with someone, the first thing that person wants to know, the first thing that they are most interested in is they want to know, do you love them regardless of their response to your message? Like they have to be utterly convinced that your love for them is not based on their response to what you're saying. That you love them even if they do not, even if they continue to reject your message or deny your God, you still love them, even though they don't believe the way you want them to believe. You know why you can still love them? Because even if they don't believe the way you want them to believe, you can look at that person in the eye and you can say, you are still someone for whom Jesus died. And you have worth. And I love you for that. I don't care how you respond. I just love you. So we have to be persistent. And the only way we're persistent is if we see them as people, not as projects. And then we also have to make sure that we are presenting this in a very personal way. Paul says, let your conversation be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. First, it's a conversation, not a presentation, and that implies that there's a lot of listening that's taking place. Somebody just asked me outside, hey, what's a good first step in kind of engaging someone? And I said, a great first step is to ask them, hey, tell me about your spiritual history. Tell me about your spiritual experience. Tell me about, have you had experience with church? What do you believe? Learning where they're coming from. Learning what they believe, how they formed those beliefs, how they came to those beliefs or those unbeliefs. That's a conversation. And he says you have to listen to them so that you may know how to answer everyone, every unique individual. The only way you'll know how to answer every unique individual is if you sit down and look them in the eye and listen to their story very, very carefully. Then you'll be able to know who that person is and how best to take the beauty and the value of this gospel message and to share it with them in a way that they can receive it, that they can hear it. Part of that is instead of trying to convince them what the gospel can do for them, which there's a lot of great things that being a Christian can do for you. Here's the thing I think we need to concentrate on. Let's talk about what God has already done for them, because that's what's exciting. Like even before you believed, even before you knew, even before you loved God, even before you ever sang a song or prayed a prayer or read the Bible, even while you were living as if God did not exist, let me tell you what God did for you. That's a beautiful message. So how do we wrap this up? Well, Dallas Willard, he complains that people read Matthew 7:6 and they misinterpret it. And when we look at that and we assume that there are a category of people in the world that we shouldn't even waste our time with, then we would make Jesus a hypocrite. He said, if that were true, if that interpretation were true, and we just don't feed the pigs, that there are people out there we shouldn't even worry about, then that'd be the foolproof proof that Jesus is a hypocrite. And why is that? Because Jesus spent almost all of his time with those people, with the people that all the people of religion had written off. Jesus, like a magnet, is the one, he seems to be drawn to those people. They had his heart. He was drawn to them. Because in a way, when you get down to it, the pearl of the gospel, it's not just some sort of correct, orthodox, well-spoken, eloquent description of the gospel. Really, you know what's the thing is beautiful? Jesus himself is the pearl. Jesus himself is the one that's beautiful and valuable because he embodies that message. He is that message. Jesus is the pearl. And I said before, some of you here, and you're just kicking the tires of Christianity. Here's what I would encourage you to do, and we'll be done with this. Remember the merchant before? We talked about the merchant went around, and he dealt in fine pearls, and he sees the one pearl, the pearl of exquisite value, and it says his response is he sells everything that he has to buy the one pearl. And we look at that and go, that just seems crazy, but it's really not crazy at all. Because what does he do? Well, he has all these years of looking at pearls, and he's accumulated all this knowledge about pearls. And then he takes all that knowledge and he looks at this one pearl and he passes that new pearl through the filter of all of that knowledge, and it comes out on the other end, and he knows that it is something he's never seen before. It is utterly unique. It's totally valuable, beautiful. It's worth everything. Some of you are on a quest. Some of you are searching. That's what this man was. He was a picture of a spiritual searcher, and you're searching, and you have picked up and put down all different kinds of religions and philosophies, different methods of self-satisfaction and even self-salvation. And here's what I encourage you to do. I want you think you know the gospel, but chances are you don't really. Because what I want to encourage you to do, we have a cultural assumption of understanding what the gospel is, cultural assumption of understanding who Jesus is. Here's what I want you to do. Set that cultural assumption aside. Set aside those preconceived notions, and I want you to do an objective study of Jesus and the gospel, and I want you to pass that through all the knowledge of all the belief systems and all the philosophies and all the other religions in the world and all the other ways we try to satisfy and save ourselves. And I think when you come out on the other end of that, what you'll find is the beauty and the value of Jesus, how he's utterly unique, and he's worth everything. He's worth everything. And we'll sell whatever we have to have him, to pursue him, and we're driven by the desire to tell others about him. Because you find something beautiful, what do? You say, look at this. Let's go around and let's tell people, all the people in our lives, hey, look at this. You're not going to believe this. It's beautiful. It's valuable. It's a pearl. Let's pray together. God, help us as we leave here this week to rethink how we engage with those people in our life, the people that we are working next to, living next to, people that are on our kids' sports teams. Help us to see them in a whole new way. As we interact with them this week, keep this parable at the top of mind. Help us to be very careful not to thoughtlessly cast the gospel, or how to callously reject them as candidates for the gospel. Help us just to consider how we can best translate the gospel into the language they can understand. Help us to listen carefully. Help us to have compassion, love, empathy, but also boldness to still declare the truth of what sin is and how we needed someone outside of us to come and save us. But let's do it in a way that they can hear it and receive it. We pray this in Jesus' name.